Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations. An Argentinian archbishop with a history of criticizing the actions of Francis has written an article for LifeSite News a few days ago, warning the faithful about the likely consequences of the Synod on synodality. The Archbishop Hector Aguer, and yes, I did look up how to pronounce his name, invokes the warnings of the Marian apparitions of the last century, which in his words warn against a poisonous administration of evil in the Church. Yes, he's calling either the Synod or Francis evil, take your pick, and in his article he exposes the Synod as something that doesn't fit into the Catholic tradition of synods in the first place. If you're not familiar with him, Rorate Celi, in an article they published of his 2 years ago, describes him this way, quote, Archbishop Hector Aguer is a well-known Argentine bishop, characterized by his very broad culture, his conduct openly favorable to the natural order, and his struggle against the enemies of the faith and the Church. After a fruitful ecclesiastical career, he became Archbishop of the city of La Plata, capital of the province of Buenos Aires. His relationship with Pope Francis was always correct, obedient, and in accordance with his authority. However, it is public knowledge that the theological current to which Francis adheres, as well as his worldview in general, do not coincide with the thinking of Archbishop Aguer, more focused on the actual guardianship of tradition. End quote. I'm sorry for not having featured his writings earlier in this channel, or if I have, that it's been so long that I've forgotten. But in addition to this story, we have another that does make the point the Archbishop is trying to make in this article more clear, so we'll start there. That the purpose of the Synod is to, in fact, to force change upon the Church. Headline from the National Catholic Reporter. Cardinal Grech, central figure in Pope's plan to change Catholic Church. So, no one has satisfactorily explained to me why the Church needs to change. They've been pushing for change in the Church for 70 years or more at this point, since these problems began well before Vatican II. And never have the revolutionaries and so-called reformers demanding change been able to explain why the Church needs to change. Human beings certainly need to change. Hearts absolutely need to change. But why does the Church need to change? Why does the spotless bride of Christ need to change? No one can offer an answer to that question that doesn't boil down to the Church needing to get with the times and stop being so rigid. And despite their heretical leanings, the National Catholic Reporter is absolutely right in this article. Cardinal Grech is one of the point men for Francis to force this change upon the Church. And they spend a lot of time going over his history and how he has come to sort of the heretical position he is in now. It describes him as a repentant reformer. He has repented of his alliance with Benedict XVI, although he never does quite come out and say that, in that pontiff's staunch opposition to the ideologies of the flesh that permeate the world today. At one point, Grech unequivocally opposed those ideologies. Now he's had a change of heart, and the article describes that at length before we get to this. Quote, in 2019, the Vatican announced that Grech had been named as Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, effectively serving as Pope Francis's point person to not just organize and oversee synod meetings that take place in Rome every couple of years on a particular theme, but to put synodality at the heart of the reforms taking place in Francis's papacy. Synodality, the Cardinal would later explain, was becoming more than just an event, but a process and a new way of being Church that would allow the global institution to become more consultative and listen to all the people of God. Pressed on concrete changes that could emerge from the Synod, Grech again focuses on process. A canon lawyer by training, he said the Vatican should put together a group of canonists, as well as theologians who are experts in the theology of canon law, to, quote, reflect how synodality can be the backbone of the structure of the entire Church. I would love to have that today, Grech said, adding that synodal structures are already existing in canon law, such as pastoral councils and finance councils for local parishes, and that they need to be better enshrined into the practices of the Church. One concrete outcome of the 2019 Synod for the Amazon was the approval of a first-of-its-kind ecclesial conference for the Amazon region that is lay-led, rather than governed by bishops. Asked if this might be another synodal outcome, with a move toward ecclesial conferences rather than episcopal conferences, Grech said he believed it would likely not be a move from one structure to another, but rather the formation of additional structures. But Grech maintains nothing is predetermined. If I come here with an agenda or fixed ideas, the Cardinal said, I am not listening. End quote. Okay, so the article spends a lot of time making it an unnamed American article who compared the Synod to opening Pandora's box look like an unreasonable villain. Now, that cardinal is, of course, Cardinal Grech, who, again, they refused to name in the article. And the National Catholic Reporter has spilled a lot of ink trying to undermine Grech in recent weeks. But Grech is the point person, along with Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, for facilitating change in the Church. This change, we're told, is going to be led by the laity. This brings us to Archbishop Hector Aguer, who warns us that this is, of course, not true. That the laity are being used as instruments for change, as an excuse to change the Church. But all the changes that are made is worth being that he is trying to remind us here is going to be approved by Francis. He will be the one responsible for all of this. This moment of democracy in the Church is an illusion, like it often is in the secular world. What we're seeing play out in the Church probably has a predetermined outcome, even if Grech and Hollerich aren't in on it. Archbishop Aguer published this article in LifeSite News earlier this week, and it came out and went by with little fanfare. So let's take a look at a couple of his points. First, the Archbishop exposes the Synod as the farce that it truly is, when he writes here about the radical elements in the Synod, reflecting Francis's own inclinations. Quote, the recent Synod proposed by Rome has novel and unusual characteristics. It has been going on for 2 years, with consultation extended through the dioceses to the whole Church. The whole thing is an exaggeration, impossible to realize. The alleged democracy hides the reality. The results will be decided by the pontiff, and it is difficult for him to give up the voluntary management of the guidelines he wants. At this stage of the Francis pontificate, it is already known which inclinations and trends will be registered in the Synod. Let it look like democracy. I decide who can be fooled. The synodal time is several years in the making. Another new feature is the participation of lay people, and according to the perspective of the ideology of the flesh, also of women. This is the first time this has happened. The bishops are not the only participants. End quote. And that's a key point here. True synods don't involve laity voting in the process or even participating. They are events of bishops, cardinals, and other members of the hierarchy. They are events of the hierarchy and of the magisterium. The laity are not really involved. That makes a synod on synodality a novelty in the history of the Church, and novelty has always been rejected. It has always been viewed with extreme suspicion. The purpose of this novelty in the Church today is pretty obvious, though. The laity are mere instruments for change. Francis knew before announcing the Synod that the laity were more radical than most priests. He's seen the same data the rest of us have seen that shows that the laity have adopted the ideologies of the world. They are servants of the secular authorities, and statistically speaking, the laity in the West oppose the Church's teachings on matters of the flesh and on morality broadly, and that the laity want ordination opened up as widely as possible to include everybody under the sun. He knew that before launching the Synod. There's simply no way he wouldn't know that. Which brings us to this next point of the archbishops. He denounces Francis's alliances with secular authorities, especially those particularly misanthropic ones who believe that there are too many human beings around at the present moment and seem to be actively doing things to fix that problem. The Archbishop explicitly calls for the Pope to denounce the plans they've announced to attempt to radically restructure civilization by the end of the decade, and failing that by the mid-century at the latest. And of course, Francis won't denounce that. The Archbishop follows that denunciation with an accusation dressed up in mystical language. The Church has been infiltrated, he says, by the enemies of God. Quote, there is another interpretation which recognizes in the mistaking of the path a component of a preternatural order, the lurking of the enemy of God, of the Church, of man. It is appropriate to recall the discernment that Paul VI unexpectedly reached in the midst of the chaos of the 1970s. Through some crack, the smoke of Satan has seeped into the Church of today. I exclude all millenarianism. The end is approaching analogically at various historical moments in the life of the Church. The Marian apparitions of the last century warn against the poisonous administration of evil, of sin that ruins the work of God. The testimony of the saints also allow us to recognize this poisonous administration of evil. It is not we who are approaching the end of history. It is history that is approaching us. And thus the principle that movement is faster towards the end assures us that the movement accelerates, the end is fulfilled. The progressivism of the present pontificate reappears in the midst of the ruins it has produced, and thus deploys its last resources. It is from this perspective that we can interpret the life of the Church, in which God's providence is also manifested. Let us remain humble before the mystery of the unfathomable designs of the Lord of history." End quote. What we are witnessing is history playing out. We're not necessarily seeing the end of all things. History is approaching us. It's an interesting perspective, made all the more interesting by his invoking Marian apparitions and the warnings of mystics, something I've covered extensively on this channel in the past. He's right, though. It does appear that we are approaching some kind of event, some sort of inflection point, driven by God in response to evil in the world. Now, he is right that mystics and Marian apparitions have warned the Church that these times were coming, and that wicked men in the priesthood will be central to everything we see play out in the world today. Now, are we seeing everything play out as they said? Is he being a tad melodramatic? Is the Synod actually not that big of a deal? And should we be worried that Cardinal Grech was a more orthodox bishop a few years ago, but then had a come-to-Satan moment when he was confronted with the pain that those who live the James Martin life are experiencing? Let me know in the comments what you think of all this, please. And a like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to share this on social media, that helps a lot too. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.